Good afternoon, and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, refugee agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who is interested in learning more, we hope you enjoy today's session, Refugee Reading, Add to Your List of Refugee-Related Titles. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programming across the United States. Let's see if you want to, next slide, Grace. As a reminder for everyone joining the Lunch and Learn today, there is a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. And since today we're discussing refugee-related titles, we hope some of you may have your own recommendations that you can throw in there during the Q&A period. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please just raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box and we will assist you. Additionally, the presentation and the list of recommended books and a recording will be sent to everyone via email. This brings us to our presenters today. Let's see, our presenters are Katie Randall of CWS or Church World Service, I believe joining us from Wilmington, North Carolina. Ahmed Keshta of Interfaith Ministries for Greater Houston from Houston, Texas. Next we have, let's see, Faisal Ibrahim in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Sarah Ivory from Salt Lake City, Utah. And I am Brian Casey, Resource and Learning Manager at Refugee Welcome Collective. So according to UNHCR, or the United Nations Refugee Agency, there are over 21 million refugees this year in 2021. If we include in that number asylum seekers or people who are inside their home country still, internally displaced persons, but were forced to flee their home, the United Nations estimates that 1 in every 88 people has fled their home and started a new life in another locality or in another country. So with so many of our neighbors locally and internationally sharing this experience, it's no surprise, and I guess thankfully we have a wealth of both fiction and nonfiction books that are written by refugees or about the experience of a refugee or someone having to flee their home. Our presenters today were asked to share a book that they have read that is refugee related. The titles are a wide range of books, but I hope one of them catches your interest and you can add it to your to-read list. I also think we have a great group of presenters today, so I'm glad that you get to meet them. We'll start with you, Katie. Katie is the National Co-Sponsorship Associate for the National Office of Church World Service. Katie, what book are you sharing with us? And if you could just tell us what it's about and a quotation and perhaps why you liked it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the book that I am sharing is called Illegal by Owen Colfer and Andrew Duncan, illustrated by Giovanni Regano. And it's actually a graphic novel. And these are, so you can see the illustrations here. And I have to admit that I am a sucker for graphic novels. Before I came to CWS, I was an English professor. And graphic novels are something that I'm really passionate about in university education. A lot of people associate them with young adult fiction or children's literature because it's like, oh, they're like comics, they're for kids, they're illustrated. But there's been a big uptick in graphic narratives for a displacement and resettlement and refugee narratives. And I think there's something really evocative and powerful in illustrating a narrative, especially when you're talking about displacement. You get to see, you have a better sense of the journey, in my opinion, when it's not just text, but you're also seeing images. So this particular narrative called Illegal is a fictional narrative based on interviews that the authors did with refugees from Ghana about the journey that they make to get to Europe. So it follows a fictional boy called Ibo, and he's in Ghana, and he and his brother their mother died, and they're trying to get to Europe where their older sister is. And they're both young boys, and it follows their journey of trying to raise money to pay smugglers, human traffickers, to get them across the Sahara Desert to Libya, and then on a boat to cross the Mediterranean to Italy. And as you might imagine, it's very harrowing kind of imagery. It shows them crossing the Sahara. You can see that this is the process of them being on the truck. People are falling off the truck. They're running out of water. You see the illustrations become more gaunt, and them talking about it, later on they get on the boat, and it's a raft, a little dinghy, and their experience being on that boat. And my favorite, there are two parts to the quote that I really like, or two quotes from here that I like. And the first is about the title of the book, being illegal. And part of the narrative follows Ibo and his brother as they're trying to escape authorities. They're trying to dodge authorities, like as they cross the Sahara, when they get to Libya, because they know they'll be sent back to Ghana and they'll have to do this journey again. So the book starts with a quote from Elie Wiesel, who is the famous Holocaust survivor, right, and Nobel laureate. And he says, "You who are so-called illegal aliens must know that no human being is illegal. That is a contradiction in terms. How can a human being be illegal?" And so there's a point in here where Ibo and his brother are on a dinghy that is collapsing, and they see a larger boat that is also a smuggling boat, but it's more stable, coming towards them. And Ibo says, "They found us just in time." And someone else on the dinghy says, "Yes, if." And Ibo says, "What do you mean if? If what? They must help us. We are people." And I love that part, and I love again seeing the illustrations and the representation of the desperation on their faces, and also the determination. And I think that line that we are people, like getting to see the illustrations of these, it's fictional people, but the representations of faces and crowds and groups, and you see the humanity in these hundreds of people on these boats that are unsafe, and it's very clear in the visual that they're unsafe. Anyway, it's a great story. I need to track down, I have a list of other graphic novels about displacement and refugee resettlement that I have promised to people on my team. So when I track that down, I'll share it with you, Brianne, and maybe you can send it to attendees. But again, I think the graphic novel format is so powerful with these kinds of displacement narratives. And it's a great story, really, really well illustrated, really well written. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Katie. Yeah, and it like introduces us to those people too, or what have you. Thank you. And I know that you have to jump off, but thank you for the recommendation as well. Let's see, Ahmed, we'll go with you next. Ahmed is the volunteer outreach coordinator at Interfaith Ministries for Greater Houston. Interfaith Ministries is a local refugee resettlement agency welcoming thousands of refugees to Houston every year. Ahmed, I imagine your work keeps you busy, but apparently you also have time to read. What book are you sharing with us?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Brianne. Appreciate that. So what I'm sharing today is a book by Hiba Gawayed. It's called Refugee: How the State Shapes Human Potential. Essentially, the book discusses a documentation of the journey of several refugee families, specifically Syrian refugees, across 3 different resettlement situations, or 3 different resettlement locations, I should say, the United States, Canada, and Germany. And it basically discusses the role of state policies and the norms surrounding resettlement in these different countries and how that really impacts human capital and human potential. So it discusses, for example, the US emphasis on self-sufficiency and essentially how somebody arrives here and within 3 months they go from a humanitarian case to somebody in the labor market, essentially. You have Canada, which has a slightly more difficult situation to integrate in, a different culture, still kind of finding itself, but a much more generous social services network, and abilities for people to essentially take the first year to kind of integrate, navigate, get training, and get equipped to enter the labor market. And then you have Germany, where there really isn't where being German is more associated with your birthright. It's a much more homogenous kind of society. So refugees, while they have a lot of opportunities for vocational training, the cultural aspect is still kind of difficult. So it really tracks the journey for people going to these different countries. They found, for example, different families that were in pretty much similar situations in Syria. And then when they left, it tracked their journey across a few years. Hibagoite kind of visited them and saw where they're at. I love the book because it includes data. So 2016 to 2018, how many of these families in different countries became employed, became self-sufficient. It includes interviews with these folks and a discussion of their lives back home and how that changed. It goes over the different formats in which people become refugees. So you have the asylum seekers that went to Germany, and then you have Canada and the United States where people went through the refugee resettlement process. And there are really some lessons there. So Germany had an influx of Syrians that went through the asylum process. And right now we're seeing basically essentially an influx of Afghans that are parolees. It's not exactly the same, but it's not the traditional refugee resettlement process. So we do have some lessons to learn, for example, from the German experience, but also from Canada, where folks over the long run, it seems like they do better. So our average for refugees here, for them to become accustomed, is at least 10 years. And that, obviously tells us that this 3-month process is kind of, or 3-month self-sufficiency plan is a lot of times really not enough. So a quote from the book that I really enjoyed was, resettlement is not an option for most people in need of refuge. That for those of us that work in the sector, we understand that we only get a minority of the world's population that are refugees. So it's also good to kind of remember that while we're trying to address issues here, we also do have to keep in mind the crises abroad and how it's really a global crisis. So we need to basically treat the underlying conditions as well. Again, I love the book because of the data, because of the stories in it about these different Syrian families, about the lessons that we can learn for the current crisis, be it with Afghans, with Ukrainians. Again, a comparative discussion of refugee resettlement across different countries. That was very valuable, and the book had a lot of emphasis on the human potential and human capital and how we need to look at these folks, not just as humanitarian cases abroad and then simply labor when they get here, but as different people that had skills, that had stories, that have trauma that we have to address in a much more generous and compassionate way. But also, if we do the proper investment and the work up front, there is potential for these people to, again, capitalize on their already existing human capital and to really let them live their lives and achieve self-sufficiency, but achieve it in a more long-term way and not get them stuck in the US welfare poverty trap that unfortunately a lot of even Americans that were born here are kind of stuck in, just because of the way policies are set out. But,
Yeah, no, and
yeah.
I appreciate. I think that our attendees are joining these webinars, right, to like learn about refugees and welcoming newcomers. And I do think it's so seldom that we are able to kind of look at and see how they do it in different countries, and kind of how what are the promising practices that we can adopt here. And I'm already seeing a theme, right, which I feel like is why we read books anyway, that both you and Katie talked about how the book that you shared, even though they're kind of different, like did allow you to just kind of like interact, even though it's reading with these people, right, as like individuals or groups or what have you. And I guess that's the benefit of literature, right, is just being able to see the people in different countries and across different experiences or what have you. Let's see, I see Kathleen joined us. Kathleen is the program coordinator and outreach specialist at Every Campus a Refuge, or ECAR, out of Guilford College. ECAR is a nonprofit program that provides best practices, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Kathleen, on how colleges and universities around the globe can become a refuge by following processes and hosting refugees on campus grounds, and then assisting refugees in resettlement. And so Kathleen, you can correct me if I'm wrong about any of that, and welcome you to recommend a book as well.
Yeah, you're good. That's it. We host refugees on college campuses, and collaborate to figure out what does that support look like on different campuses. But the basic idea is 3 months, 3 to 6 months of free rent and support from college campuses for a newly arrived family or individual. Which actually kind of brings me into my book recommendation, which is American Refuge, True Stories of the Refugee Experience by Dr. Dia Abdo, who's the founder of Every Campus a Refuge. So this book actually comes out, I have an early copy of it. It comes out September 6th. But I chose this book not just because it's written by my mentor and supervisor, but more because of the way that I think Dia really tells stories in such a powerful way. So the book is combining her own story as the daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees with some stories from guests we've hosted who are eager to share their story in some context. So she goes through what does their experience look like having been hosted on a college campus, what led to their displacement, what experiences have they had in the US even a couple of years after being here. She conducted the interviews in 2020 and 2021, so there are insights into some of the refugee experience around COVID, what that looked like and how it disproportionately really affected refugees. And it's really a beautifully told book. Dia is an English major or an English professor at Guilford College, so she has really a way with words that I think perfectly suits her for telling these stories in a really meaningful, intentional, and compassionate way, where it's not she's very intentional to make sure that the voices in the stories are the stories that the people she's interviewing want to tell, the way that they want to share those experiences, and looking at what resettlement looks like as far as context, as well as on an individual scale. So kind of the overarching, what does it mean to be a refugee, as well as the kind of individual experiences of some of the guests. And it's really just a beautifully told book. The quote that I decided to choose is actually the first line, because I think it encompasses a lot, but it's, when human beings find themselves compelled to move, who are we to tell them they must stop? And so Dia really combines so many pieces in the creation of this book. And it's a very poetic book, but also very much rooted in reality and rooted in the facts, as someone who's worked in refugee support and engagement since 2015, and designed and directed this program since then. So it's really a great insight into the way that creative thinking and creative problem solving and listening to the people who are most impacted by an issue can help develop humanitarian reactions in response to crises. So yeah, that's my recommendation.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful quote too. Yeah, and I'm interested to see just how, like, the different experiences of the folks all coming to Greensboro, too, from different backgrounds, or what have you. Let me see. I guess next we'll move along to Faisal, and Faisal is a Master of Arts student with a concentration in refugees, forced migration, and belonging at Clark University. He also has experience working with refugee communities in New England, and I believe in his home state of Ohio as well. So Faisal is a current scholar. You likely have a lot of books on your shelves. Can you recommend one of them to us today?
So mine is more like part of my research for this semester. It's Somalis in Maine. It talks about context of actually it started with Catherine Besterman's book called Making Refuge, and then this tells voices of refugees before the war in Somalia in 1991, and then talks about it when they arrived in Lewiston, Maine. So imagine sitting in a room and meeting someone you knew prior to 1991 war in Somalia, where you do your master's research in Somalia, and then you realize they've had children, it's been generations, and the war is still going on. So then she talks about context of how tribal factors or status, or basically are you more on the lower end of this status in regards to like the community of Somalis where you live as then and then now? And so she talks about their movement from Somalia in the south between the rivers of Juba and Shabelle, and then moves to Kenya as a refugee camp in accordance to 1951 refugee conventions. Who is a signatory, who is not a signatory, what are they doing, and then how much of a limbo are refugees in what, how long are they stuck in the spaces of like refuge camps there? And then she moves on again to the final resettlement spaces in Lewiston, Maine, and then how the Somali Bantus went through xenophobia within local communities, from a letter from the mayor of Lewiston saying we don't really want these people here. So there's a whole cause of issues. And then a lot of times, like, because Somalis are very homogeneous, we move together in groups. So I call my cousin and say, hey, I'm in Lewiston, Maine. This is a really good place. You should come. And then they bring their cousins. So we move in thousands. That brings in to the question to like it brings into like the best quote for me is if you see Abdi Robles' Somali Diaspora Project, as I was talking about with Brian the other day. This is early 2000. I think I was in high school still when this project was out, and he had done research like photography plus like information. And so in the beginning of this book, or like the Somalis in Maine, he says this book is a timely documentation of journey of Somalis into Maine, capturing the voices of the people. So a lot of times we hear, like editors or like authors write about the people. In this case, it's about the people telling their story. So it's more like a refugee-focused approach compared to an editor or an author, because there's a lot of biases coming from a different perspective. So this is the people telling their story. And then he says these stories will inform the perceptions of those who have moved to new land and who educate others on how to be able to adjust or manage. As far as like my opinion in this case is I am Somali, so unfortunately I'm not Somali Bantu, so I'm from the other end or the other spectrum of it. And so again, I still have my biases in regards to conversation because I grew up in a very different space. Columbus, Ohio is very welcoming of Somalis, and so they're very like, we're in the system with the people. Fortunately, my mother happened to be working in the refugee migration as well, so I kind of grew up learning from her. And then my favorite quote is basically from like page 280 of this book. There's two actually specifics. One is by a 40-year-old male called Rashid in Somalia in 1985. It says, we Somalis have a superiority complex. We think we are better than many. One of the things that really used to amuse me when I first came here, I used to watch Phil Donahue. He would bring all these racist people on his show. I'm like, okay, so he's saying he is better than me. He must be dreaming. This white racist is talking about how they're better than me. And I'm thinking, what an idiot. Do you know I'm Somali? Like the fact that I already know that I'm Somali, I already have the context in myself between status quo or within the tribal or the clan system within Somalia. And then the second one is a female who's in her 20s in 2004. And she states like, okay, knowing your tribe or knowing your clan is more like an identity factor. Just knowing where you came from is a good thing. Not to use it against others, but informational purposes. So again, those are things that actually apply in my case a lot, because when you have local conversations in Somalia or in Somaliland or in Kenya, these are places I've spent almost 7 years around, like in the last 10, and you hear the old men talking. The story is never the same, because again, we have a really like a poetic way of saying things in traditional spaces, depending on who's saying it. So the perspective is always dependent on the clan or the person or the status or the place or the movement or your family. There's never an original story that's one overall. It's always a different angle to one major story. We are people on the move. We're constantly moving. So a lot of questions I get asked is, how many Somalis actually live in Somalia compared to outside? I'm like, I don't know, because we don't really have that data. There's so many IDP camps in Somalia. We have refugee migrations, refugee camps in Kenya, in Ethiopia. So I can't really calculate because the data is not given. UNHCR tries, but then we don't really have full information about it. And then I'll give you one last one is I was in high school sitting in a car with some friends, and I was speaking to my mother in Swahili on the phone. My friend was talking to his sister in Urdu, and we're all Somali. So we're sitting in the car. I'm like, I've never heard that before. And then he's like, I've never heard that before. My perspective is more like, I'm across the border. You're all the way in Pakistan, and you're surprised about me. So with people on the move, languages change, people change. So we migrate in different angles again. I'd recommend reading like Making Refuge by Catherine Westerman, because she tells the story from specifically one village to Lewiston, Maine, and it's really passionate to hear the stories of people over time and their children.
Yeah, no, thanks, Faisal. Like Kathleen's quote, although now I don't remember it exactly. You know, when people are moving, you can't stop them, or what have you. And yeah, and I even imagine, you know, if there are any people joining us today that maybe feel like they don't have time at the moment to like sit down and read, you know, like these books. Honestly, it sounds like even if you just like got it from the library and opened to different pages and like read a few quotations like you were saying from the folks in, you know, Lewiston or in, you know, Greensboro, yeah, I'd recommend that to anyone too, because it sounds like some of these quotes that you all are sharing, that kind of, if you just paged through the book, if you didn't feel up to reading through the whole thing, you might get some good insights as well. Let's see, we can move on to Sarah. Sarah is the U.S. president of USA Hello. USA Hello is an online center for refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants, where newcomers can find education opportunities and informational resources to help them get settled in the U.S. And Sarah, I believe you're our last official presenter, and not to leave out any younger viewers out there, although there may not be that many younger viewers joining our Lunch and Learns, but there might be some people joining the Lunch and Learn that have some young people in their homes or in their lives. But Sarah, you're going to share a children's book with us, right?
Yes, that's right. It's great to be here with you all. I'm sharing this children's book, Lubna and Pebble, with you today. It's by Wendy Midor and it's illustrated by Daniel Agneas. It is a really, really beautiful book, and there are a few different things I really enjoyed about it. It's a story of a young girl named Lubna who leaves her home and is forced to flee war. She travels by boat. We know just kind of bits and pieces. We know that she arrives in something that she calls the world of tents, and she's with her father and has left behind the rest of her family. And she finds a pebble when she first lands on the beach. And when she gets to the refugee camp, she finds a pen and draws a little face on it. And this pebble becomes really important to her and her kind of first friend. And she confides her fears and brings this pebble with her everywhere. And then a new little boy comes to the camp who's all alone and is scared, and she introduces him to Pebble and they become good friends. Eventually she leaves, and she leaves Pebble with Amir, her new friend, for his comfort. A few things that I really love about the book. One is that the illustrations are just like really, really stunning. I don't know if I can share, but they're really large, and the book is pretty sparse on language, and I think that that's really, really helpful in something that's a really heavy topic like this. Also, you know, it helps to span a wide range of ages. My daughter's only 14 months, so she's not, you know, that into the words so much as she's into stealing the book and looking at the pictures, but it allows you to kind of imagine the rest of the story. And so for a younger age group, it might be just what they're seeing on the page, but I could absolutely see this book being used in a little bit older age group where you're having discussion questions, you're pulling them out a little bit more. It leaves a lot to the imagination. I think, you know, another thing that I really appreciate about the book is that it touches on the really, the many layers of nuance of this experience, that there are all these different emotions and there's so much that you're leaving behind. One of my favorite quotes, or my favorite page, is it says, "One day Daddy was beaming, he was leaving. We are leaving, we found a new home. Lubna felt happy and then sad, and Amir cried." And it touches on, like, in this one experience where they're going someplace else, it's incredibly happy for the father, it's mixed feelings for the daughter, and it's very sad for the friend they're leaving behind. And I think it really touches on how complex and how many different ways of emotion people will feel. You know, I think it's easy for us to kind of assume this relief and happiness when someone's coming here. And of course, that's one emotion of many that people are experiencing. So I really loved that it touched on that. And yeah, and I think The other thing that I really love about the book is that it's just this really lovely message of kindness, you know, that she's, there's a scene where she's becoming best friends with Amir and they play all day, and she comes home and she tells her Pebble at night, don't worry, you're still my best friend. And she talks to this rock, and then she leaves it and sacrifices that to leave it for comfort for Amir. And on the very last page, we have the same kind of image of a close-up of a face where he's saying hello to the Pebble as his new friend. So I would definitely recommend this. Like I said, my daughter's only 14 months, so definitely on the lower end, but I think this could go all the way up through grade school, and it's just a really beautiful story.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and I could see, I think it's one of those children's books too. A lot of times later in life, I like go back and read a children's book and just realize that I kind of missed something. And I could see, you know, like any child just kind of seeing like the lesson of like sharing, you know, she like shares the pebble or what have you. But then you, like you said, it kind of shares different experiences in the pathway of, you know, being in a camp and then going on to a new country. But let's see. So thank you for sharing that one with us as well. We're now going to begin answering any questions submitted through the questions panel. And if you're joining us today, you might be a reader yourself. So I want to invite any attendees to provide some recommendations of refugee-related titles in the questions pane in your control panel. But yeah, so if you have a book, or perhaps if you have a question for one of our readers today, you can share it. Someone is asking, with fiction's ability to help us enter into these worlds, can you recommend any novels? Let me see. And actually, let's see. I can share a novel. Let's see. So I wanted to share with you, and like I said, while I'm sharing, if you all can type in any recommendations, that would be great. Let me see. So a work of fiction that I wanted to share is City of Saints and Thieves by Natalie Anderson. And it's not very focused on, you know, refugees and migration, but I'm sharing it because it's just a good book. It's actually young adult fiction, and it has a good plot. It kind of grabs you from the beginning. And I'm not much of like an adventure mystery person, but it's just a good young adult adventure mystery. It's set in Kenya, and the protagonist is this like smart young teenager who's a refugee from Congo, and it's fiction. But it also just kind of like reminds you of the experience. She came to with her family to Kenya, to this kind of like fictional city, I think, in Kenya. But she's like solving mysteries and kind of kicking butt or what have you. And the fact that she and her family are refugees from Congo are kind of backstory or what have you. Let me see. And actually, Grace, I'm having a tricky time. Grace or Derek, can you see? Can you share any other questions or recommendations with us?
There's a question, Brianne, asking for novel recommendations. So fiction.
Yeah, so I've got my fiction one. I'm trying to think of any other fiction. Can you all think of any other fiction around refugees? But this one, City of Saints and Thieves, is a good one. And actually, I think the same author has another work of fiction that's refugee related as well. Yeah, and if anybody else has any other recommendations.
My recommendation would be, can you guys hear me? Okay, so my recommendation is we talked about it with my professor the other day on a call with Brianne. It's called Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. It's fictional character of there's two brothers from basically they're Afghani refugees who lived in Pakistan, Peshawar, and they have a path of paying like people under the table to cross borders all the way to England, and how as their process goes through, like it's all fictional. They talk about these imaginary doors of how people are like it's basically set up or like, oh, these imaginary doors are like entrances to different spaces, or basically the global north, how everybody thinks the grass is greener on this end. So how do we go to Germany? There's an imaginary door to Germany. And then it tells you the process, or like what they need to do to get to have paperwork or like basically legal documentation while they're there. Then it's all imaginary, talking about this. It's called Magical Doors. It's very interesting if you see it. I'd say it's a good read for the first time if you're actually looking at refugees, not in reality, but in a fictional space. And then when you come and actually review like 1951 convention, you can see who the signatories are, what's accepted. For example, Pakistan is not, they don't have to take Afghan refugees. They choose to because they're neighbors. Iran is a signatory, so they'll take the refugees and have better options in Iran than they do have in Pakistan. But then again, this has been going on for the last like 230 years before the borders were established. So like a lot of times it's more, it tells you like, hey, prior to the borders, we already had the space. The culture was there. We are the same. Then the borders came in. Now we have a division in between. So we have to go through these doors where like I need paperwork to go see my cousin just across the street because there's a borderline in between. So those are like things you can see in the book as the story goes along, all the way to England and that.
Yeah, no, some interesting concepts to think about. What was the name of that one again, Faisal?
Exit West by Mohsin Hamid.
Okay, and we do have a good number of additional recommendations coming in. Let's see, one is After the Last Border, I believe, by Jessica Goudot. And like I said, you all will receive these via email. And that one is about two families' experiences in Syria and Myanmar or Burma, plus history of US refugee policies since World War II. There's another Asylum by Adafi Akporo about seeking asylum in the US. Let me see.
I can definitely recommend The Displaced Writers on Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives by Viet Nguyen, if I'm not mistaken. It's basically just the stories of 5 different refugee families from 5 different parts of the world. I mean, it's not a novel, but again, stories are incredibly powerful at, again, giving you that image and just instilling in folks sympathy, empathy, and understanding of, you know, these people are not just figures. When we say 21 million, 25 million refugees, each of those people is each of those is a person that is a brother, a mother, a father. They have their own story, they have their own struggles, and they have their own aspirations. So stories are just great at giving us that context and making sure that we remember that.
Yeah, no, sometimes the actual stories are better than the novels, right? Than the fiction. There's someone who's joining us today who said that they're doing a book club with refugee girls aged 7 to 14 and are interested in any recommendations. If there are anybody in there that wants to offer any recommendations, one that comes to mind is it's not about refugees, I don't think, but it's this book called Seed Folks. I haven't read it in a long time. So Carrie, she submitted this question. Give it a quick page through before you read it with your book group. And I believe the author's name is Fleischman. But it's kind of a cool story about different people in a neighborhood, and a lot of them are immigrants. And I remember liking that book. It's called Seed Folks. And I don't remember if one of the immigrants is from a refugee background, but they might be. But regardless, it's just a good story of community and different people contribute. And it's about that like 7 to 14 age range. Let me see. Someone also recommended The Middle of Everywhere by Mary Pfeiffer. And I think that's always a good one for volunteers to read. It tells the story of, I believe, a woman who does volunteer in her community and meets several different families there, and she tells that story. Let me see. Yeah, and someone says that the book, that Middle of Everywhere by Mary Pfeiffer, is great for anyone working with a community as a reminder to the difficulties that refugees face and how you can act as a cultural guide when possible. Great. And I believe those are all of our recommendations today. Oh, here's one that I think I missed. Let's see, Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen by Jose Antonio Varga from the Philippines. And then there's another one, Behold the Dreamers Imbolo Mbue. Let's see, the last name is spelled M-B-U-E. And like I said, we'll email them out. From Cameroon, now living in Harlem, and ends up being deported back to Cameroon, but family is still in New York City. So yeah, so I appreciate all of these good recommendations. And I think we all now have a list.
One more.
Yes, Faisal.
One more. It's actually something I'm preparing to read. I haven't read it yet, but it's actually on the list. It's called The Ungrateful Refugee by Dina Nayeri. It's more like what immigrants never tell you. So sometimes, like, in regards to, like, I'll go back to one of my professors who talks about, like, just COVID. The idea of not being undocumented in Worcester, Massachusetts, even though they're offering vaccinations, a lot of refugees or basically immigrants who are undocumented here won't show up to get the vaccinations because they're afraid if I show up, they will know my name. If they know my name, I get to be thrown out of the country. So a lot of times we don't necessarily, as a refugee, for me, I'm not a refugee, but if you think about it, as a refugee, why would I want to come tell you something that's going to cause a problem for me to go back to where I came from, even though I was running for my own safety? So a lot of times the untold stories directly to the new communities they live in, or like cultural context or backgrounds, are never really shared across the space. So the voice of that refugee being out loud and heard is very important. So like sometimes people look at it, the ungrateful refugee. We've offered them all this. Why aren't they taking it? The thing is that sometimes we look at the unintended effects of something you offer to cause a problem for future issues. So that's a good recommendation. I'm looking forward to reading. I guess I still have another semester, so I'm going to enjoy that as well. So for you guys, if you have an opportunity to take a chance with it.
Yeah, no, you'll have to let me know, Faisal, if you liked it or not. Let me see. Let's see. So I do want to thank you all, and like I said, the viewers, even if you don't feel like you're up to reading a whole book, I feel like go to the library and check one of these out, and at least read some of these quotations and some of the firsthand experiences. I want to thank each of our presenters today, and thank all of you all for joining today's Lunch and Learn. Let's see, and like I said, you'll receive an email with the list of recommend titles and a video if you want to share it with any friends. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, I hope you got one, if not several books to add to your list of books to read. Thank you all, panelists and attendees, for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Happy reading.
Thank you, you too.